Hey everyone. So in this video, we are going to be talking about how to do the grid method. So the grid method is a drawing technique / tool that has been around for centuries. Artists like Michelangelo used it. I'm going to teach you how to do it now. So the most important thing about using the grid method, first and foremost, is that your paper / your final surface area versus your original image or your original drawing, the paper that's being used or the surface needs to be proportionally equal. Your original image needs to be proportionally accurate to whatever surface you're going to be putting it on, all right? So this paper is 2 times as large as this paper, okay? So what do I mean by that? So if we look at the dimensions or the measurements of the bigger paper versus the draft paper, the bigger paper is 12 by 18, okay? The draft paper is 6 by 9, okay? And we know that if you do 6 times 2, you're going to get 12. If you do 9 times 2, you're going to get 18, okay? So that means that a 1-inch square on our draft paper is going to be equal to a 2-inch square on our final paper, okay? You don't have to work in 2s, you can work in 3s. So like if I were using a 27 by 18, it would still work. Instead of it being 1 square equals a 2-inch square, it would be 1 inch square equals a 3-inch square, okay? So we've done the math, all right? I've done the math for you actually, because all of you should have paper that is proportionally, ratioed proportionally is what I mean. So here I have my original draft drawing. Now you can create your grid on your original draft, but some people don't like to do that. It's too much of a commitment, especially if you mess up. So instead, you can make a copy of your original drawing, which is what I did. I just went to the copy machine and did that, okay? So as we said before, is that we need 1-inch squares on here so we can make 1-inch squares on the bigger paper. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my ruler, and thankfully the border of the paper did come out in the copier, and I'm going to make sure that I line up my ruler correctly like this, and I'm going to make marks at every inch. So like that. All right, so I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I should have 6 spaces going this way. Then I'm gonna turn my paper, and I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna make sure that I line up my ruler correctly, so I'm lining it up against the edge of the paper, making sure that the 9 is as close as possible to this mark. I'm actually gonna use this part to measure it, all right? And then again, going to mark every inch. Right? Now I gotta turn my paper again. All right, you have to do these measurements on all sides of the paper in order for it to come out correctly. All right, so again, line it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, and then turn the paper one more time and do it again. If your paper isn't cut perfectly straight, it might be a little bit off, but that's okay. All right, so I have marked every inch around the perimeter of my paper, okay? Now we're gonna actually start making the squares. So I think that it is so much easier when your grid stands out against your drawing, or vice versa, when your drawing stands out against your grid, okay? So I'm not going to use pencil to actually make my grid. I think I'm either gonna use Sharpie or I'm gonna use a pink pen. I think I'm gonna use a pink pen. Okay, so now what you need to do is I'm gonna start with this column here. So I'm gonna line my ruler up against this top mark here, and then I'm gonna make sure that it is lined up against this first bottom mark here. Double check in just to make sure. Let's see, let me maybe move it like this so that way you can definitely see it. All right, so I'm lining this up. All right. You want to make sure that it's really, really lined up. That's why it's taking me a while. All right, then you want to take your pen or whatever you're using and draw your line. Make sure that you hold down the ruler really well so that way it doesn't move. So I got my first column. Gonna do the second one now. All right, so I've done all my columns. Now I'm gonna move on to my rows. Okay, so now I have gridded my image. I have 6 squares going across, and I have 9 squares going down, okay? Another thing that I like to do before I start is number the squares. So I'm gonna do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You could do numbers and then you could do letters. It's whatever. It's whatever works easier for you. Numbers works easiest for me. Okay? Now we need to translate this to the larger paper. So I'm going to put this off to the side and I'm going to get my big piece of paper. So as we said before is that so we did 1 inch squares for the draft paper. We need to do 2 inch squares for the final paper. So that means instead of counting by 1s, we need to count by 2s. So again, I'm going to line up the ruler, making sure that the edge of the ruler is lined up against the edge of the paper and that the 12 does meet or is very, very close to meeting the other edge of the paper. And then, like I said, I'm gonna count by 2. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, all right? I'm gonna spin it. Again, make sure that it's lined up against the edges of the paper. Then I do again, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, right? Spin it. Again, make sure that everything's lined up. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Again, line it up with the edges of the paper. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. Okay, so when you are drawing the actual lines for your vinyl paper, you don't want to use like a pen or anything permanent because you will eventually have to erase it. All right, so I am going to use my pencil. So what you're gonna do when you go to start making these lines is you are going to trace them as lightly as possible. So I'm gonna start with the first row, just because you can see it better. I'm gonna make sure that I line up the ruler with those first marks, making sure that the ruler is touching both of them, and then hold down the ruler really securely, and then very lightly with my pencil, as light as I can get it with it still showing up, I draw my line, okay? I'm gonna go across the paper. So again, line up, get ready, line up. Very good. Okay, so I just finished all my rows. Now I'm gonna move on to my columns. So because my ruler is exactly the same length as the paper, I am gonna have to be really careful to make sure that that the edge of the ruler is lining up with the paper, so that way I get a straight line the entire way across. Right, so holding it down, I made sure that the edges were lined up really well against the edges of the paper. And then again, I'm just going to draw really lightly and trace those lines. Okay, I should have 9 squares across and, 9 squares going up and down and 6 squares going across. So again, what I'm gonna do just to make my life easier is I'm going to number the squares. 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, now we are ready to start drawing. So some people like to just work square by square. So like, say for instance, if I were to start with this first square 1 by 1, I would want to start with this D, okay? So let me show you how I would handle that. So if we're looking at the letter D in this picture, one thing that can help you is that you can always divide this again. You can always divide it into quarters, okay? So as you can see, the left side of the letter D touches about the halfway point, okay? So what I'm gonna do is in this first square, I'm going to really lightly divide that into quarters. And then I know that, and then I could even divide this space as well. All right. And so the top of the letter D goes about here. Then this left-hand side of it comes to that halfway point. It does dip in a little bit. And then the letter kind of comes up here. And then I'll just kind of guesstimate the inner part, okay? So I got the letter D in here, all right? And then if you can see is that the D comes out just a little bit. So I'll draw that in there, all right? So you can go square by square, but sometimes I think that it's a little bit easier to tackle simpler areas first. So what I mean by that is like this square right here. So again, if I were to divide this square into quarters, this slope meets the middle of the paper right here and then doesn't really touch like the halfway point of like these squares, okay? So let me divide this into quarters. You don't always have to divide into quarters, just sometimes it makes it easier, okay? So this line where it intersects to the next one is gonna be at the halfway point, and then I'll just kind of guesstimate this curve, okay? If I go to the square underneath it, this line is pretty much exactly that middle point. So I will just slope that down straight. And then there's this other line here. It doesn't quite touch the edge. So I'm gonna do my best to try to mimic that. And then this part is also pretty easy to map out, right? And as you can see is when I'm drawing a little bit darker than I was with my grid, okay? So then this line doesn't quite meet this middle point here. And then it comes out and goes just to that corner, right? And then this line kind of just hugs this side, right? Now, if you look in this square right here, so we're skipping this one for a second, there's just this little tiny area. That would be really easy to draw in. So I'm just gonna draw that and then connect, okay? So I'm going to continue working on this drawing and then I will come back when it's done. All right, so now that I have finished my drawing, I can now start erasing the things that I don't need. Just a couple little things is that the spikes in this shape were way too complicated. So instead what I did was I just circled where they kind of all ended, and then I just kind of improvised it here. I also improvised with the text here, and I tried to stay faithful to the logo, but that was a little bit difficult. So it's not super completely accurate, but that's, again, totally okay. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take a good eraser and I'm just going to start erasing the lines of my grid. As you can see is that I did, like I said earlier, try to make my drawing darker than my grid, which will help me for this part. So while you're erasing, make sure that you're hanging onto the paper really well so that way it doesn't crimp the way that it just did. If it happens, it happens. Just try to avoid it. So I'm hanging onto it really well. I'm just going to erase what I can, because when I Sharpie, if I Sharpie everything that I need to keep, I can just over it with the eraser. So I'm just gonna do what I can for now. I'm not gonna worry too much about anything that's like inside of other shapes. I'm just gonna try to erase any grids that are around spaces or any inside of any big spaces. So basically here I'm just continuing to erase. Like I said, if I were to Sharpie this, I could just erase the rest of it a lot easier, but yeah, that's how you do the grid method in a nutshell. Good luck.